Welcome to CBC Windsor News at 6. I'm Meg Roberts. Thanks so much for spending part of your evening with us tonight. Well, Ontario and Michigan have signed a document to build stronger economic ties. We have details about what's in the agreement. Plus, City of Windsor administration is recommending stricter rules when it comes to the approval of new always stops. We'll tell you why. And we dive deep into algae blooms on Lake Erie and what that bright green slime means for fish and the people eating them. Ontario and Michigan are set to become closer economically. Premier Doug Ford signed a memorandum of understanding with Governor Gretchen Whitmer today. They hope this agreement will increase cross-border trade and attract investment. The CBC's TJ Deer joins us now from the Ambassador Bridge. TJ, what can you tell us about some of the details of the agreement?
Well, Premier Ford said that the deal would help integrate both local supply chains as well as build both economies, and particularly to prioritize things like electric vehicles. Now, the Ambassador Bridge is actually the busiest land border crossing on the continent, and officials say there's roughly $80 billion worth of trade that goes back and forth between Ontario and Michigan. Now, mainly officials hope this agreement will help attract trade as well as increase trade as well as attract new investment and jobs to both regions. However, officials at today's virtual announcement didn't say how the MOU would help accomplish any of that. A border expert I spoke with earlier today says that this is excellent news and hopes that the MOU will help create more resilient supply chains that are not affected by outside factors.
What we saw very clearly during the pandemic was the need for what people will refer to as resilient supply chains. And a lot of effort from the federal level, from Washington and Ottawa, on how we can build closer relationships with our trading partners to build these resilient supply chains. And I think this is what part of the effort needs to zero in on.
Now, Liardi Anderson said that this deal would help build both, is crucial not just for both local economies, but for the federal economies of Ontario, of Canada and the U.S. as well.
TJ, I believe you were alluding to this a little bit earlier, but part of the MOU says that it would help create jobs. Were there any specifics given about that?
Unfortunately not, but I did speak with Corey Schenken. He is the special projects lead at Workforce Windsor Essex. He says that the deal is good for the region and speculated that the MOU will lead to job growth and attract investment here, but he wasn't aware of any specifics on how that would be accomplished either. Now, the provincial government did say that this MOU between Ontario and Michigan is part of their trade strategy with the U.S. and that they're hoping to secure more deals with other U.S. states to attract more investment and government opportunities for Ontario businesses, so we may see more deals like this in the future. Meg?
Well, thanks so much for that, TJ. It's not hard to find always stops in the city. They're everywhere. Now, some are wondering if Windsor has too many and what that means for the environment. Jacob Barker has more on that.
In the past, always stops like this one have been considered effective tools in dealing with traffic problems that the City of Windsor finds itself with. It even says that in a recent report by a city administration. However, for councillors that are looking to get new always stops installed, well, that's not so easy these days.
In my experience in my first term on council was such that every time there was an application for a four-way stop, it wasn't approved because the threshold was too high.
Windsor's rules for approving always stops is based on a 2005 policy, one that is up for review. A report going to council committee says that Windsor has a lot of unwarranted always stops. They make up a vast majority of the 230 always stops in the city. There were 135 in 2005 and upwards of 160 in 2016. The report says that these traffic controls should not be used for things people might think are obvious, like to deter traffic from entering a certain neighborhood, and they must not be used as a speed control device. Even in school zones, always stops aren't considered as effective as other tools that are out there. Things like roundabouts, raised crosswalks, and speed bumps are among things that are listed as significant tools and practices to keep students and pedestrians safer. Well, if used incorrectly, the report says unwarranted all-way stops can actually reduce safety. More rear-end collisions can occur at all-way stops that are of high volume. Pedestrians can be lured into a false sense of security by assuming motorists are going to stop when a sign is present, and average speeds can actually increase in between stop signs when drivers try to make up for a perceived loss of time.
You know, people become creatures of habit, and if they find that there's an unreasonable reason for the stop sign, they'll ignore it.
In Windsor, the city says there are more than 17.4 million kilograms of emissions created by all-way stops per year. That's enough to fill more than 524,000 shipping containers. And cost is another thing. According to administration, each stop sign costs $500 per year to maintain. That's $2,000 for every four-way stop in the city per year.
And I guess it's a situation of be careful what you wish for, because the result of the report is, in fact, to enhance the policy to mirror the guidelines, which in effect will make it in some cases more difficult to get a four-way stop.
Definitely gives you a different perspective on those all-way stops. Well, some Lake Erie anglers say algae blooms actually help them catch more fish, but there are some questions about what it means for your health when you eat those perch or pickerel.
Flat day with the algae bloom, the bite continues to be very good still, where if we don't have that algae bloom and it flattens out and it's real high sun, the bite will typically slow down quite a bit. So we've always kind of joked it's like the walleye have sunglasses when it's like that.
Algae blooms are caused when algae grows quickly in water systems. That's from excess nutrient runoff like phosphorus or nitrogen from fertilizer. One of the largest recently recorded algae blooms in western Lake Erie occurred in 2017. Some fishers say if the blooms get thick enough, they provide enough shade for that fish often accumulate underneath the green slime. That makes it easier to hook them. But are they safe to eat?
The papers that I've published show, well, yeah, there's two narratives here. Yes, the levels of these liver toxins, we can find them in the muscle tissues, but the levels are so low that following fish consumption advisories, it's likely it's not going to pose a human health risk. So that's great news.
Officials in Nova Scotia confirm that the remains of two children who went missing in the province's massive flooding have been recovered. The remains of a missing man have also been found. The search continues for another young person. CBC's Shayna Luck has the latest from Halifax.
For the second time in 2 days, RCMP in Nova Scotia made a grim announcement. The body of one missing child was found this morning, and it's now confirmed the human remains found yesterday were the body of the other. 4 people went missing from 2 different cars during flash flooding on the weekend. The 2 children, a man and a youth. A search continues for the youth. Yesterday, the body of the man was found in water in the same area as his car. We know more now about what happened when the people went missing. They were trying to evacuate on Highway 14 around 4 a.m. on Saturday morning. They were driving in a pickup truck and an SUV when the water swept both cars off the road and into a hayfield. That hayfield, now a lake. Ground search and rescue staff, police dogs, aircraft, boats, and industrial pumping equipment have worked for days to try to recover the missing people. Premier Tim Houston spoke to reporters about the tragic outcome.
The tragedy that's happened here is really unimaginable, really hard to comprehend, for sure. We can, in this province, we've shown we can handle a lot. We can handle a lot. We've had the fires and the hurricanes and another series of floods, but this really doesn't compare.
Meanwhile, the province is struggling to assess and repair massive infrastructure damage, including flooded homes, washed out roads, bridges, and rail lines. Shayna Luck, CBC News, Halifax.
A wildfire in southeastern British Columbia has burned 3 square kilometers of land in less than 24 hours. That's more than 700 football fields. More than 1,000 properties, including a ski resort west of Invermere, are now under threat. Strong winds are making firefighter efforts difficult in that area and near Cranbrook, about 130 kilometers to the south. Authorities report there are more than 450 active fires across BC. More than half of them are out of control. Most of the fires were caused by lightning. Almost 15,000 square kilometers of land have been burned so far this wildfire season. Editorials and analysis papers on Canada's COVID-19 response have been formally published. The documents in the British Medical Journal call for a closer look at what happened to avoid a repeat of what some are calling major pandemic failures, which include issues in long-term care homes, vaccine hoarding, and higher death rates in lower-income communities. CBC's Christine Birak has the details.
A series of articles in the British Medical Journal did a deep dive into Canada's pandemic response and found while there were successes, especially when compared against other G7 countries, there were also staggering failures. And some of those problems were completely predictable and may have cost thousands of people their lives. The successes were in vaccination rates. Canada hit over 80% vaccinated, and COVID tests were made readily available. But authors say where things really fell apart was the country seemed unprepared for this emergency. Even though a major report done after the SARS outbreak in Canada 20 years ago warned policymakers about a lot of the same issues. One example of the lapses the BMJ articles pointed out was in marginalized communities. Ontario data showed low-income communities faced the highest rates of COVID-19 in virtually every wave of the pandemic. Racialized people, essential workers were hit hardest, and yet vaccines were rolled out in more affluent communities first. Authors also said Canada hoarded vaccines, which prevented lower-income countries from vaccinating their most vulnerable people. But the worst criticisms around Canada's response to the pandemic are about how long-term care was handled.
There had been more than 100 reports sounding an alarm that such a crisis would happen in that setting for a number of different reasons. So this is why the authors call it, a kind of perfect storm that was perfectly forecast and anticipated in advance.
The authors really try to emphasize that this is a moment when change can happen. We've just lost 53,000 Canadians to COVID. Many families have suffered deep losses, and lessons need to be learned. Some doctors who are part of Canada's pandemic response support calls for a public inquiry. Others say inquiry or not, governments need to understand what's broken and fix those problems for the long term.
The real issue is sustained funding over time, sustained preparedness over time, and ensuring that these aren't line items that get crossed off on budgets 5 and 10 years from now.
Most doctors acknowledge people are exhausted by the pandemic and want to put it all behind them, but experts insist this is also the right time to act on lessons learned. The goal is to protect people, be prepared, and avoid making the same mistakes in the next pandemic. Christine Birak, CBC News, London.
A big match for Canada tomorrow at the FIFA Women's World Cup. They played to a draw against Nigeria in their first match and are now hungry for a win to move up in their division. But their Irish opponents are highly motivated too. The CBC's Lindsay Duncombe is in Perth.
Training today for the Canadian women looked focused but fun. There is no question that draw with Nigeria in the first match was disappointing, but the women tell us they are ready for Ireland.
We don't take anything for granted, any team for granted. Of course, they have that physical piece, but, at the end of the day, they can also play football. And I think that tactical piece is important as well, just as much as the physicality piece.
Moving forward, we're finding the rhythm, we're finding the flow, and that's all we can ask. And I think we're getting ourselves in good positions, and it's just about putting away the ball now.
This is the first time that Ireland is in the World Cup. They're ranked 22nd in the world, but they're from a soccer-mad country and they're a physical team. Look at that first match with Australia. Now, the Irish women lost, but they only lost by 1 goal. And when they come into this match, already with that loss behind them, they have nothing to lose. Here's how Bev Priestman is preparing for the match.
First and foremost, match that passion, hard work, horrible team to play against, and that's what we pride ourselves on, so we 1,000,000% have to match that first.
Canada is going to have to contend with a heavily Irish-focused crowd. That's because a lot of Irish people live in Australia and a lot of those people live in Perth. Combine that with the people who are traveling with the team, the fans that have come from Ireland, and there's going to be a lot of green in the stands.
Hugely passionate. Obviously this is our first major tournament for the women's team. There's a huge tradition with men's football, but now I suppose to have that cohort in behind the women's team is massive. Hugely passionate fans, hugely supportive, and just get behind the country for everything and anything.
Two things to watch for with the starting 11. Number one, will Jessie Fleming play? She didn't start against Nigeria. She was training today, looks strong, so she could be on the pitch. The second thing, what about Kadisha Buchanan? Kadisha Buchanan did not play in training today. That is because the coach said she had an illness. It is expected not to be serious, but with illnesses, you never know. So a couple of things to watch for there as we get ready for another big match. Lindsay Duncombe, CBC News, Perth.
Well, despite the women's tournament being played across the world, there are lots of people locally who are tuning in.
Soccer itself has evolved, not only allowing international and globally has expanded, but at a secondary and post-secondary level has allowed young girls to dream huge.
I sit down with women in Windsor, Essex, who've changed the local soccer game. We'll have more on that tomorrow night. Well, another local woman who's made a major impact on sport, LaSalle's Kylie Moss, is on the world swimming stage yet again. The four-time Olympic medalist failing to reach the podium in the women's 100-meter backstroke. Moss finished fourth in 59.09 seconds today in Japan. She's the 2017 and 2019 world champion of the event. Australian Kaylee McEwen won the gold medal in a world championship record time of 57.53. Two Americans earned the silver and bronze. Moss was attempting to become only the second Canadian swimmer to win a medal in 4 consecutive world championships. That would have matched swimming great Ryan Cochran. Well, if you were brave enough to venture outside today, you know it was hot. Is that sticking around? Meteorologist Colette Kennedy will be with us after the break. Okay, Colette, I've always been a big fan of the warm weather. I feel like I'm kind of like a lizard in that way, but today was that type of hot where you're just plain old uncomfortable.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have compared you to a lizard, but you made the comparison.
Sometimes I can be.
Yeah, I enjoy the heat as well. And, you know, we're talking short term about this warming up that we have for southwestern Ontario. But also, if we look at what's happening globally and the much bigger problem with climate change. So we do know that the last 3 weeks have been the hottest that the planet has seen. And quite likely this whole month, July, will end up being the hottest month we've seen. I don't see anything stopping that with us moving into this El Nino pattern. But also we look at the World Weather Attribution Group. So a report, some data has come out from them that they put this report together. They're really looking at humans' influence on inducing climate change and how we've amplified things. So in terms of the heat dome and the heat wave taking place in the southern U.S. and into parts of Mexico, well, now because of humans, this could occur as frequently as 1 in every 15 years. And without human influence, these numbers and duration wouldn't even likely be possible. And the same thing, except that for Europe, we're talking about, and Northern Africa, 1 in every 10 years. Now, without human influence, China, they say it could, the data shows it could be possible to see the kind of heat waves and durations we're seeing 1 in every 250 years, except now the influence makes it 1 in every 5. So if we don't stop burning fossil fuels and make changes, that's the direction we're going. So that's a long-term big picture. Back to the short term, the next 3 days, and what we're looking at more locally is the heat warning issued from Environment Canada. Those temperatures into the low 30s, humidex values close to 40, and not a lot of relief overnight either when the temperatures still, the lows are around 20. So our current temperatures aren't actually nearly as oppressive where they're going. So we're going to see this ramping up here Wednesday, Thursday, Friday until we get a front that's going to come through and provide some relief as we go into the weekend. So things should be feeling a little bit better then. A quieter night for the overnight tonight and the start to the day tomorrow. So not looking at active weather then, but as we get to midday, we could get a little bit of a preview with a few little sprinkles coming as this next system approaches. Then as we get into the later afternoon and evening, we have a better chance of seeing some heavier downpours, some embedded thunderstorms in there, and watching the timing. If it's late enough, then we won't worry so much about them being severe, but the chance is there. Overnight temperatures, there they are, that 20 to 21 degrees for our overnight low. Tomorrow's high, I'm anticipating 31, the humidex at least 38. And then into Thursday, we'll clear out behind that system. It turns into a nice day if you can take the mugginess, if you've got a little lizard in you. Friday as well. And then we'll see another system come through, and that's going to change things for that weekend.
Definitely some alarming numbers in that report there, Colette.
Yeah, it really just keeps driving home the point that we have to make changes.
Well, thanks so much for that, Colette.
You're welcome.
Well, it's always entertaining when Windsor gets a shout out on Jeopardy. Coming up, we'll share with you the latest local question asked on the game show. a tough decision handing over a pet to someone who may be able to better care for it. But humane societies and animal shelters across Canada say they're seeing that at an alarming rate. The CBC's Travis Danraj explains why that's happening.
No, I didn't name them, no.
Cute and cuddly, but now homeless. 2 kittens abandoned amid an affordability crisis. The pair being shuffled to Toronto's Humane Society, the organization that rescued them, overwhelmed.
I mean, we have a lot of people, we get emails every day or every other day asking us to surrender cats, asking if they can surrender cats to us. We just don't have the resources.
Inside, cages upon cages of animals waiting for a home.
It's dogs, cats, rabbits, guinea pigs. Right now we even have some snakes.
Pet surrenders are way up, adoptions down. Shelters saying in many cases people who adopted pets during the pandemic are now overwhelmed. Add that to rising inflation and job insecurity. While the shelter isn't at capacity, smaller ones across the country are, raising fears of the worst.
No one goes into this industry, whether it's within sheltering or veterinary care, to euthanize animals. That's not what we want to be in. Same with pet owners. That's probably the worst days of their lives.
Calgary-based Parachute for Pets helps families avoid that.
Pet food bank, education, vet care assistance, anything that can break down the barrier that's going to cause a pet guardian to have to surrender or euthanize their pet.
There's also a push toward more foster parents as a bridge to being reunited with their owners.
It's real rough. Cost of living keeps going up.
Joe Medeiros is finding it tough to provide basic vet care. Loki has an ear infection.
With COVID, work was limited for everybody, and then cost of living just tripled or more in places, right?
Even if you can't foster or adopt, pet organizations say you can still help by donating cash or pet supplies like toys and food to your local shelter. Travis Danraj, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, were you able to guess one of last night's Jeopardy questions? The city of Windsor was briefly featured on the hit game show. Have a look.
Let's do international books for 1,200.
Ghost Stories, a graphic novel from Canadian Jeff Lemire, is set in a town outside this city across the river from Detroit. Taylor.
What is Windsor?
Yes.
It amazes me always about how much these contestants get right. The 2008 graphic novel Ghost Stories is part 2 in Lemire's Essex County trilogy. Well, that's it for CBC Windsor News. Don't forget, for news anytime, go to our website at cbc.ca/Windsor. We're on social media too. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram. The National, as usual, is on at 10 p.m. Thanks so much for tuning in. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow night.